These days, whenever I hear news of a latest whatever special Lamborghini that they've made this weekend, I just find myself not really caring, because there's something about it which feels very corporate, like they just keep doing these special vehicles that feel like just recycled versions of the same platform over and over again, and to a lesser or greater degree, depending on your personal preference, Bugatti is certainly egregious in that regard as well, as is McLaren, making so many different variations of the same essential idea. But I think Lamborghini, for me, just comes off as worse. Just something about it rubs me the wrong way, and I don't like the corporate kind of Audi-infused feel that a lot of these have. Back when the Reventon came out, though, it didn't feel that way. When you'd have something like a Superleggera, or a Balboni, or a Reventon, or even something like an LP650, which I believe was for the Japanese market, I think it was, or the Chinese market, and exclusive, these felt more special because they didn't happen as often. If you think back, for example, to the days of the Diablo, if the Diablo GTR came out these days, it'd be just another Lamborghini supercar. But at the time, that was a massively special vehicle, and as such, it's far more collectible for many supercar fans than pretty much anything else in that kind of vein that they've made since. Which brings me back to this. See, I don't think this has a massive chance of returning, and much like the Veneno and various others, it doesn't necessarily need to, but I think the difference is, this one actually would be useful, and because of the era it comes from, it's when supercars were, as crazy as it sounds, a little bit more modest, if anything. This one basically has the same spec as the LP640, which of course we have now in GT7 again, and it's so much better in 7 than it was in 6, and that also kind of gives me more confidence to say that it would be a good car to bring back, because if it's anything like that, which it certainly used to be, it should be at least as good, if not more fun. And incidentally, another thing that's great in the Reventon's favour is back in GT6, when you fully built it, it was more powerful than the LP640, which was a pretty cool advantage to have. It was quicker as well for top-end speed, and if I recall correctly, even the handling wasn't quite as twitchy. So if they were to bring it back, if it kept any of that kind of vibe, well, that would be a pretty damn good start. Of course, it was already a premium, it had some visual upgrades as well in GT6 at the time, and the fact that the graphics look so good for that console, for that era, is always a huge leg up, a huge step up over many of the less obvious non-premium etc. choices. Now, of course, the biggest disadvantage, a disadvantage in a general sense because it kind of goes with the territory, is how much more expensive this one was compared to the LP640. It was 1.2 million credits. I'd be very curious to see what kind of price it would be if it were brought back. It could be a Legends car, I guess, or it could be in the Lamborghini dealership because it's not a classic. I'm not sure how exactly they would take that approach. I'm guessing probably the Lambo dealer more likely than not, but I really do think that the Reventon would be very, very well received if it were brought back. I think the community would love to have this vehicle back. And if you think about it, the fact that the Veneno is also so much better in 7 than it was in 6 adds more so to the allure of this one coming back as well, because if it was already decent back then, whereas the LP640 really wasn't, and the LP640 is good now, well then this should be great now if they brought it back by that logic. It is ultimately much like the Veneno, a vehicle which you don't need. You don't need to have it in the game, you don't need to buy it, you don't need to use it, you never did. But you could kind of say that for most Lamborghinis in Gran Turismo, if we're being honest about it, and yet that brings me to a fascinating realisation which I've had. In fact, it's an ongoing realisation wherein if you look through the special projects that I've done, especially the teaser trailers that I do for those, if I include Lamborghini in the thumbnail, it tends to get more views, which I find fascinating because there's clearly this special love that the community has, and yet their cars themselves are mostly okay. They're mostly fine. In Gran Turismo, they're not like the best in any particular way, generally speaking, unless you're talking about like maybe an SUV. And now of course the Urus is fantastic for that, because of course it is. Aside from that, there's no particular reason to necessarily choose a Lambo over anything else. Certainly not when it comes to something like a Vision GT, that's for sure. Ultimately, my thoughts on the Reventon are way more positive and way more favourable, as I think you can tell, than pretty much any of their other specials that have come along since, because something about them, as I said earlier on, just doesn't quite hit the same. It feels expected now. It feels like they're just churning out these specials, which by definition makes them less special. Whereas this, back then, The idea of the already fantastic and wonderful LP640 being inspired by like a stealth bomber and combining those two things together, making like the Batmobile of supercars, well, of course we love it, of course it's badass. The Roadster, would it be even cooler? Of course you can make an argument for that, and I'd love to see the Roadster rather than just bringing back the coupe version, but either way, I think this one has a decent chance of coming back. It's not essential, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, and I wouldn't bet money on it, but this to me is one of those GT6 picks where I could see being, as I've said before with a few others, kind of a day one vehicle. I wouldn't necessarily see them slapping this in a trailer, for example, for like a Gran Turismo 8 or whatever, but I could see it being in the game from day one, just quietly added to the dealership as a nice surprise when we get into the game. That to me sounds more viable, and it wouldn't really surprise me. I'd love to hear your thoughts though. I know this was a popular car. It pretty much always is a popular car in every game which it pops up in. And of course I'd love to hear from those who maybe disagree on the point of special Lamborghinis. Maybe it is just me, but I don't think it is just me who feels that way about their latest stuff. Ultimately though, that's it for my thoughts on the Reventon. Of course I'll see you with more GT6 content in future, and for now, thanks for watching.